Thank you and welcome. I'm glad everyone's here, and it is a unique experience to be able to run a program, and we're going to try to do something here to make this center a destination center for sports law, for sports thought, for sports business, for any topical issues going on in the areas of sports. We're going to be talking about it, and we're going to be leading from above and trying to see where the issues go. And this is that. What we're trying to do today is bring a transformative event on an issue that is bubbled up as maybe the issue going forward in the study of sports, the study of sports law, and frankly, societal issues in sports. Today, and we'll get to it in a minute, I think we're going to try to go from all angles. From the angle of lawyers, from the angle of doctors, from the angle of players that are surrounding me now, from the angle of what's next, and not only for football, for all sports. Obviously, the NFL case is getting a lot of attention. We'll drill down and go into it. It may be the issue going forward with the world's most popular sports league and the National Football League. Now they've got a 10-year agreement with the players. They've got an 8-year agreement with the refs. And they've got labor peace, and franchises are selling for $1 billion. New television networks are buying in record television deals. These are salad days for the NFL, but for this concussion lawsuit going forward. And the number one issue in football is player safety, and we see why this concussion environment is surrounding everything going on in sports, not only football. So I want this to be a really comprehensive landmark event to look at all the issues and to look at it from every angle we can, to hopefully give you a sense of where this is, where it has been, where it's going, and do we have a new culture, a new awareness culture where players don't necessarily think they need to, want to, or have to, quote unquote, play through. Do we have a new culture in this country when it comes to head injuries? So let's begin. I'm really honored and flattered to have this group around me today. Let me introduce our first panel quickly, and then I'll have them introduce them with a little more detail and get into some discussions of what former players have dealt with this injury. To my far right is Taylor Twellman, a colleague at ESPN, an accomplished soccer player and now soccer analyst for ESPN, covering these games every week. And he has been a voice in this area, and a voice that I respect a lot. I'm happy to have him. To my immediate right is Jim Nelson. Jim is a good friend and a player that I was with at the Packers, played for the Packers, Colts, Ravens, Vikings as well. I hate to say Vikings, they were my rival. And Jim now works for Comcast, has made a great career for himself here in Philadelphia. Happy to have Jim. To my immediate left is Keith Primeau. You all know him, famous hockey player with many teams, including the Flyers, and has been a voice in this area as well. StopConcussions.com. He'll talk about his blog. He'll talk about his experiences. I was at a premiere for the movie Head Games months ago and saw the story of Keith Primeau, and I said, I got to get that guy, and I'm so glad he's here. And to my far left, needs no introduction, a guy named Westbrook, first name Brian, played for the Eagles, star football player, and more importantly, graduate of Villanova University. So welcome. What I'll do now is have each of the panelists, if they will, spend a few minutes talking about their career, their experience with concussions, their experience with the league as it was then, and maybe the league as it is now, and their insights into this topical issue. We'll start with Taylor.
So we're in a panel of football and hockey guys. You start with the soccer guy?
That's right. I bet there are more soccer players.
I might have to move. Jeffrey Moorad started with back in those days of how they dealt with concussions. August 30th, 2008, my life changed forever. August 30th, 2008. I ran into there was a cross inside the 18-yard box. Keeper came out. He missed the ball, punched me in the face, scored the goal, went over and celebrated, and did the following test. Follow my finger, count down from 100. Taylor, what's your name? Did you score the goal? That was 2008. So when I hear the sayings back in those days, I like to remind people that being only 33 years old, I don't know if I still think it sometimes we're back in those days. My career ended at the age of 28. I was the fastest MLS player to ever score 100 goals. My life has completely changed forever. I haven't worked out in 4 years. I've seen 2 movies in a theater in 4 years. I can't go to concerts. I have serious limitations for the rest of my life. Junior Seau was a dear friend of mine. He was my next door neighbor. When he drove his car off the cliff, I reached out continuously, never heard back from him, and we all know what Junior Seau ended up. I bring this up because what we need to realize is that as I'm sitting up here with a panel of football and hockey players, yes, they get all the attention. But the reality is there's millions and millions more kids playing my sport, playing the sport of soccer. And that is why I've started a foundation, one, to help myself deal with the issue, thinktaylor.org. And we've come up with 2 sayings. One, it's the CARE program. If we start with a concussion awareness, recognition, education program, then 2 things will change: the recognition and rehabilitation of concussions. These 3 gentlemen standing to my left all wore helmets, all played a sport that was a contact sport. Soccer's a contact sport. So we have to address the issue the right way, and the right way is through education, because right now, March 15, 2013, if I read you the emails of everyone out here, parents, lawyers, doesn't matter what you are, any single person in this room can get a concussion. And while the NFL and the NHL will get this, they'll get the headlines, the reality is someone could be sitting out here and fall out of their chair. Someone could get in a car accident, knock on wood, on the way home today. At some point, we all need to become more educated on the sport, on the injury of concussions. And that's why I'm here today, and I appreciate Andrew inviting me.
Thanks, Jim. Well, thank you. My name is Jim Nelson. Andrew's a good friend, so much of a good friend over the years that when I first started playing, he actually fired me from the Green Bay Packers. But it kind of goes to show, Andrew, the relationship and the kind of person Andrew is, that he welcomed me back here. So I guess I'm up here speaking for the 60% of the NFL guys that not a lot of people talk about. I think, concussion issues that, when we talk about Steve Young and Troy Aikman and these guys whose careers are cut short, I'm here to speak to about those guys who you don't hear about, and who cannot afford to go to the doctor, to the training room, because the window, as you know, in this league is so small for players, and you are doing whatever you can to get on the field. And to actually go and talk to a doctor if you are dizzy, and I've seen this hundreds of times when I was playing, and I did it myself. You couldn't afford to talk to them. You had to just suck it up, get on the field. And I think that's the part that we miss with this. And I think this is why it's coming more to the forefront. And I'm glad that where this is headed, I think more recognition, obviously, to that part, that segment of the professional athlete is really important. So thank you for having me. And Keith.
Good morning. I think in my instance, I'd start with my own personal case history. I suffered through 4 documented concussions, but that was only part of the story. I started playing the game of ice hockey at 5 years old, and I'm often asked if I know exactly how many concussions I did suffer through, and my honest answer is I have no idea. I know that number is north of 10. I just don't know what the number is. I suffered my first documented concussion in 1997 when I was playing for the Hartford Whalers, and that was when they first began to take the issue of concussions partly serious. Everybody in this room might recognize the name Eric Lindros, and he was really the first player that brought it headlines in the sport of hockey. And the protocol for my first concussion was 1 week of full rest, no activity, no contact, no practice. And I thought, well, how novel that was. They're really concerned about my well-being, only to get further into my own case history and understand that it's not a light switch. It doesn't go off after a week, and all of a sudden you're feeling better. My second documented concussion was in the playoffs in May of 2000. I was taken off the ice on a stretcher, stayed in the Pittsburgh hospital overnight, and was sent in for my baseline testing the next day. And I'd like to discuss baselines briefly in a second, but we had taken our baseline test at the start of the year. I went back in for to be retested for my baseline, and I knew what I was doing. I was going in there to pass my baseline. At the end of my test, the neurologist looked at me and she said, "Keith, I know what you're doing." And I kind of laughed at her, and I said, What are you talking about? And she says, "Just please be careful." And I said, "I'll be careful." I returned to the ice 2 nights later to play in the first game of the Eastern Conference Stanley Cup semifinals. Ended up getting in a fight that night. And when I reflect on that as probably the beginning of the demise for me personally. And that's where we need to make the biggest cultural shift and the cultural changes is that it's not play through anything and it's not win at all costs. We need to understand it's just a game and we have an entire life to live. My third documented concussion was in January 2004. At this point, I was out for 6 weeks. Now I'm starting to see the effects of repetitive head injury. My return to health time frame started to become greater. And then to suffer my fourth and last documented concussion in October 2005, of which is now 8 years removed. And it took me the better part of 7 years before I started to feel any semblance of normalcy. And Taylor touched on the story of Junior Seau, and I don't know if everybody knows the story of Dave Duerson. But these are, for post-concussion sufferers or brain injury sufferers, these are real stories because I don't know what my breaking point was. I don't think I was anywhere near my breaking point, but when you wake up every day and you don't feel well, you don't feel right, it takes its toll. And to know the story of Dave Duerson as a post-concussion sufferer, I get it. And I know that these guys up here probably get it as well, that it's very real and it's very difficult. And I know we can't see the injury, but trust me, people suffer.
Thanks, Keith. Brian?
Good morning. Just like Andrew mentioned, 9 years in the NFL, 2 teams, Philadelphia Eagles, and 1 year with the San Francisco 49ers, and most importantly, a Villanova grad. So that always feels good to come back here and be able to say that. Just like everyone else here, there's your documented concussions, and then there's the other ones that go undocumented. I had 2 documented concussions. One, my first one on a Monday night in Washington, D.C., playing against the Redskins. I was knocked out cold. I lay on the field for about a minute and a half. The trainers later on jokingly said that you were there snoring on the football field, just completely knocked out. The next one, about 6 weeks later, playing against the San Diego Chargers, thought I took enough time off to rest and recuperate, thought I was healed completely, passed all the baseline tests, passed all the tests, being able to go out there, excuse me, being able to go out and practice without headaches, things like that, dizziness. But I got hit with a small, I got my bell rung type of hit and was out for another few weeks with another concussion. Just like so many other people understand and know now, it's not always the hit where you're knocked out that is actually the concussion. A lot of the smaller hits, smaller contacts between, in football, offensive linemen, we're in a small space, the small hits repetitively are the concussions. And so many times, and I think so many people have said it, it's about educating. It's about changing the culture. It's about allowing the coaches to understand that these are the concussion symptoms. This is what happens with concussions. Just because the young man looks okay, he's walking and talking fine, does not mean that he's healthy and he should be able to go out there and play again. This is not an ankle injury. This is not an arm injury. This is not a shoulder injury where if he can run, he can throw the football, he can tackle, he can play. This is a head injury, and we've talked about it upstairs a little bit, me and Keith and Andrew. So many people, kids, and they look at the situation with Alex Smith out in San Francisco this year. He went out with a concussion this year, and he was replaced. And the old saying back in the day was, you can't lose your position to an injury. And that's just not true anymore. They're going to allow the best players, the guys that give them the best opportunity to win, to play. And little did Alex know that a kid, Colin Kaepernick, would come in and kind of take over his team by storm and lead his team to a Super Bowl. And now that has a lot of players, young kids have saw it as well, and they're saying, well, I'll never go out of the game with not only a concussion but with an injury. And it kind of adds on to the thought process is if you can walk and talk, you should be able to go out there and play. And so there has to be a culture change. Keith mentioned it starts at the grassroots. A lot of the younger kids are understanding it, but it's the bad examples that some of the professional players and older kids will give. And, sports become about money. And they say, well, if I can still play, I'm never going to tell anybody that I have these symptoms. I'm never going to tell anybody that my head, every time I move my head's rattling a little bit. And unfortunately, a lot of these young men don't understand the impact that it will have on them later on in life. Not when you're 23, not when you're 33, but when you're 35 and 40 and you can't remember certain things that you should be able to remember. You have the early onset of Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that, brain disease. Those things are serious. And, for a guy that played with injury, a lot of times where I shouldn't have, ankles, knees, things like that, I should have taken time off. The brain injury is one of the worst things to be able to play with because you think you can play, and sometimes you need a teammate, a coach, a trainer to say enough is enough. And unfortunately, some of those guys don't have the education and the knowledge to be able to tell you that, you know what, you need to sit down and think about how this is going to affect not only today and tomorrow and next year, but how it's going to affect you when you're 45 and 50 years old as well.
It's a great point, and let's continue on that. Where are we changing? And that's the question. We've all talked about this culture of playing through, this culture of not letting your team down, this culture of fighting for a job, keeping your job. With this new awareness, with all the headlines, with meetings like these, are we changing? And the second part of that question I'd love to hear is, are players protecting themselves, or is there some other motive that we need to protect players from themselves? What you've talked about, Brian, what you've talked about, Jim, Keith, trying to continue to play through, is that changing? And how do we change it beyond baseline testing, beyond taking kickoffs out, beyond making these inherently violent games nonviolent? So what are the players doing, and are leagues doing enough?
Well, I think the number one thing is, like I mentioned, you have to start at the youngest group of kids. You have to say, listen, when this happens and you feel this is what a concussion is. You know what an ankle injury is. You know what a hip injury, a knee injury. You understand that. This is what a concussion is. Now, these are the results of a concussion, and this is how it happens. And so you have to start there and then allow those kids to continue to grow up. And then once they get into the professional level, then they'll at least have the awareness. And so I would rather be able to say, I understand what this is, and I know what's going on, opposed to I had no clue that I was actually having a concussion. And every time I shook my head, that means that, and I feel my brain moving around inside, that there was a concussion going on. I struggle with a lot of the older kids. I talked to LaShawn McCoy this season. He had a concussion, and he said, I want to get back out there and play. This is 2 weeks after he had a concussion. I said, well, can you do this? Can you run? Can you practice? Can you think without having a headache? He was like, no. He said, but we're losing, and I got to get back out there. And I said, well, that's one way to think about it. But I said, the truth is that you go back out there, you suffer another concussion, then and he wants to make money and do those types of things, then people are going to start labeling you as concussions. Then your value to the NFL is not going to be there. But more importantly, your value to your family, to yourself, your latter part of your life, you have to start thinking about that. And, luckily he came back after a long rest and played. But, these kids have to start thinking about a little bit further than just today.
And I'll say that, the change, whatever change is being done in the NFL and whatever they're doing to protect players, I see it more as a father of 3 kids, more in the community, where I ask more not, whether you had a concussion, those kind of things. It's, should I sign my kid up for football? And that was stuff that I think probably 10 years ago wasn't discussed. And whatever's being done by the NFL, the biggest thing I think is just the awareness of of these problems. So I see it as a father of 3 kids and in a community where kids are starting to push away from football a little bit. And and I have a kid that's at the age of tackle football, and I ask myself those same questions. Am I going to expose him to this at this age? Does he need it? Football is one of those games, and you could play other sports. You don't need to play football when you're 7 years old, 8 years old. So
Is that what you've told him?
I think he's okay with it. I mean, he's kids are so involved in other things. There's so many other avenues out there for him, and like Taylor. I mean, you can have the worst concussion playing soccer too. So, but from my perspective, I see whatever change is being done, it's being felt in the communities.
Andrew, I want to answer your question with, and Jim said it earlier, 60% of NFL players. What I wrote down immediately was, are we talking about what the pro athlete is doing, or are we talking about the amateur athlete? And as a society, I raised this question for you. We have a Little League Baseball rule of 65 pitches, you have to take 3 to 4 days off. We are more concerned as a society over a rotator cuff or an elbow. But we can throw a kid and put a helmet on him. Hockey's made some changes on the checking thing, but think about Pop Warner football and youth football. There's no rules on a head count. So my 9-year-old, I don't have kids, but let's say my 9-year-old daughter can go play soccer, and that coach can make her do 1,000 head balls. So while, yes, there's awareness, but the reality is I'm not concerned about the NFL and NHL athlete. Because if we educate the 7, 8-year-olds, by the time they are an NHL, NFL, MLS athlete, they're already more educated, and that's where culture change happens. Because all of us, if we were more educated on the injury of concussions, I guarantee you we would have made different decisions. Right. So I think our education has to start younger, but think of that, though. We have a Little League Baseball pitch count, but we don't have a head count. So at some point, something has to change that we protect kids before they know. I don't know if at age 9, I don't know if you guys knew what you were really doing at age 9 and 10, but the coach is throwing me a ball saying, hey, Taylor, head that ball 10, 15 times. Our kids need to be more educated.
Keith, you're experiencing symptoms, right?
I'm in a much better place today than I was 6 months ago. And 6 months ago, as I said, I was 7 years removed from my last documented concussion. So for me, it was a very long journey. I would just reiterate some of the points on the last question, and it differs a little bit in what Taylor said. And so I'm often asked if I knew then what I know now, would I change my course? And sadly, I can't say that I would. And that's for me is alarming. And part of the reason why it's important that we educate our children, because I did it because that's what I was taught. I was taught to play through injury. I was taught to be a warrior. I was taught to be out there and play through injury. And as I was going through my dark days, I sat in my office and wondered, how do we make a change? Where do we make a change? And where we make a change is at the grassroots. We make a change with our children. I don't know if I can convince a 25-year-old hockey player that if you're injured, you got to come out of the game. But I know that I can take my 10-year-old and explain that, listen, your health is far more important to me or anybody else than the game of hockey. And that's, for me is the biggest reason I started StopConcussions.com, but also such a big part of this equation.
I think it's a great point. Start early. I'll ask that, Brian. I'd like to ask Brian and Jim, are you experiencing any symptoms? And if you are, or if you do in the future, kind of what Keith said, would you do it all again?
Before I touch, I wanted to say this. I mentioned we should probably start at the grassroots, but between the kid being 7 and the time he's 23, the 16 or so years, what's going to happen in the NFL from then? So I think, or any professional league, college for that matter, I think it has to be an awareness class for coaches. Obviously, the trainers need to understand it as well. I think the trainers do, but there has to be a protocol put in place. If he has a concussion, this is this is it. He can't play for a month or whatever the time period is, because the players are going to go back out there and play. There's no doubt about that. The coaches will want them to play, and the coaches are willing to compromise a player's health. Some coaches are willing to compromise a player's health for play on the football field. And that's just the bottom line of sports. And they not only do that with concussions, but other injuries as well. And so there has to be something put in place between now we're starting at the grassroots until these guys are actually in college and into the NFL if they're going to be able to make it. As far as symptoms now, when I first had my concussion, I didn't have the typical symptoms as far as sensitive to light, headache, head pressure, things like that. A lot of players have problems with exercise. When they were exercising, they got headaches. For me, it was the opposite. I was getting headaches when I was in the classroom, when I was looking at plays, trying to understand and diagnose film. That's when I experienced my headaches. And it was good at the time because I didn't have to sit in meetings. So that was great. But, it was bad because you didn't understand. You didn't know what plays you were running. So that was part of it. But now, short-term memory loss, I'll be introduced to someone. And it's hard because sometimes you're saying, well, maybe you're just not paying attention well enough. So I'll be introduced to someone, and 5 seconds later, I will not remember their name or exactly why am I even talking to this person. So unfortunately enough for me, my symptoms are not as bad as some guys, but those things, and I'm only 33, so hopefully they won't continue to progress.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I gathered my medical records recently, and something I should have done a long time ago, and I looked up my history ever since I started in Green Bay, and the only things that were ever put in any medical records were experienced a dinging feeling, and that was the only thing that was really in any of my medical records. And I know I've been knocked out before, not in terms of unconsciousness or anything like that, but I don't know. And this is where I would like to hear the medical side of it, because me, like Brian too, I experienced short-term memory loss, but I'm not really sure if that's just because I'm getting older, and I'm not old. I mean, I'm 38 years old, but yeah.
You're ancient.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Appreciate that. So I don't know. I mean, I think we can all, it's easy to sit here and say, I'm forgetting things, but is it, my dad did the same thing. He forgot things when he got older, and we're all experiencing that at some point. So whether it's related to football or not, this is where I'd like to hear the medical side of it.
Quickly on the football, Brian and Jim, have you been approached by attorneys to join the lawsuit against the NFL? And what has been your answer, if you have?
I have, yeah, absolutely. But I don't think I don't think guys are signing up for any of these suits, to make any money. I think it's more like a petition to change, yeah, right, and just to kind of get the issue out there. I mean, I don't think these guys, in these hundreds or thousands of guys, whoever are signed up, it's not out there to make a quick buck. I think it's just out there to make some kind of change.
Right. I have not been approached by any lawyers as far.
There are plenty here. No.
Today's my lucky day. No, I haven't been approached. So if you guys have a card, just leave it on there.
Keith, I want to ask you, because we talked upstairs and you mentioned a little bit here, it is changing. You are seeing change, and more so even from the league, you're seeing change among players. This culture of not wanting to play through, you've seen that.
Yeah, and we started to touch on the topic of, how do we, as players, as competitive athletes, how do we remove ourselves from play? Well, we just don't. And who's there in lieu of us not having the ability to pull ourselves out? And it takes an educated therapist, it takes an educated trainer, it takes an educated doctor to say, you're not well, you're not right, you need to come out. In my case, I worked for the better part of 1 full year to get myself in return to play. And I remember the conversation, and this bit I think is in the movie, where I walked into the trainer's office and I sat across from him literally 11 months after my last concussion, and I said, a couple more weeks, I know I can be ready. I know I'll be ready to go. I'll be, I'm feeling better and I'm starting to feel good. And he finally just looked at me and said, you know what, Keith? He said, you know, your efforts are valiant. We appreciate your courage. But I, as a human being, could never put you back in a situation to play again, just from a moral conscience standpoint. And that was the end of my career. And it took the fortitude of somebody who was educated to tell me that I would never play again. And there's lots of cases where that doesn't happen, where if a player walks into a trainer's office and he says, I feel better, I feel, you know, I'm ready to go. The trainer's like, okay, great, we'll just send you to the doctor and we'll send you right back out there. But players are starting to recognize, and this isn't 100% of the time, this is just a general statement, that brain injury is very real. There are lifelong consequences. Just because I retired doesn't mean my injury went away. I've got to live with it for the rest of my life. And I don't know what my long-term prognosis is. But players are starting to understand that they're really become very susceptible if they continue to try and play through it.
You sense that in your sport?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably get 1,000 emails from parents saying, should we head the ball? I mean, the question of heading is coming up right now. That's definitely a question in our sport. What's very interesting to me is when Brian brought up the Alex Smith. My goal, my big picture goal, is that the RG3 injury that was trending on social media about putting him in with a knee injury, that in 10 years, we're going to be talking about Alex Smith making the right decision. That's my goal. Because when we are talking about an ACL injury, and all due respect to RG3, and whatever that situation was, he can go have surgery. He can rehab. I can't do anything. I can't. For 4 years, I've dealt with every kind of symptom in the book. Depression. I was diagnosed with diabetes because I was dizzy. But RG3 can go have surgery and then fix that. But what Alex Smith should be applauded. And if the right education's out there, every single trainer and parent is saying, Alex Smith did the exact right thing because in 20 years, he's going to be sitting up here talking, saying, I made the right decision. And that's really where I think the culture change is going to happen, is because our education is going to be brain injury is very serious. Yes, RG3, I know you did your ACL, but you can rehab every single day. Thank God Alex Smith stepped off that field.
And earlier in the season, RG3 came back 6 days after a concussion. Yep. And I think Joe Staley with the 49ers played on a Thursday night after a Sunday concussion. Yet other players, Javid Best with the Lions, it's a year and a half. So it seems like no two concussions are alike. My final question, just the future. The future of the sport you played, the future of this awareness. Is it having a positive effect? Where do we go from here? Will there be return to play guidelines in all of your sports where actually mandate an RG3 or someone like that to stay out, to do what Alex Smith did? Do you think that's coming?
Well, I think you just answered that return to play, though, because every single concussion is different, Andrew. So it's very difficult, I think, for doctors and lawyers, for that matter, to really come out with this universal rule. For instance, this term mild concussion. How many of us have ever had a mild case of diarrhea? No, I've got diarrhea. How many of us have heard the term mildly pregnant? No, I'm pregnant. So when I say that, and Sidney Crosby is a wonderful example who's diagnosed with a mild concussion and he's out 18 to 19 months. So the return to play is a really strong topic right now because it's not like an ACL or a sprained ankle where, 4 to 6 weeks. You can't say that. And the biggest aspect of that, Andrew, and all of us can say this, is that it puts a huge expectation on an athlete when you say mild, because then you're sitting here going, well, wait a minute, I don't feel good, and it's 10 days or it's 14 days. I do think there's change happen. My sport, and I'll keep this real brief, if we figure out that at the young levels, we figure out that maybe we shouldn't have a head count, or we should have a head count and limit head balls, my sport doesn't change. Barcelona is the greatest team in the world, Real Madrid. They don't need to train head balls because they can learn the fundamentals of the game. I have a concern for football. Because what are you going to do? Tell them you can't tackle? Well, that's what the sport is. Hockey's done a good job. They've limited to certain ages with checking to make the fundamentals of the game. Hockey and soccer, you can still learn the fundamentals while letting our kids get a chance to grow. Football's got a strong concern. Because what do? They play flag football. I don't think that helps. So
Well, they've tried to take the kickoffs out. They've tried to make the enforcement for violent hits stronger. The question is, as you said, how do you make an inherently violent game safe? Final comments?
Well, you were saying all these changes in the game. I think this is kind of that fine line. Now, where do you start to really change the game? I mean, it's now, we look at it, is it going to be the same game that it once was, that it always will be? I don't really know where, taking these things out of the game and now really changing what football is and how it's played. I think us as the fan part of it saying this isn't even football anymore. And I guess time will tell, really.
My contention always returns. I always bring it back to grassroots, because again, I think long term that's where we're going to have the greatest change. And the sport of where my kids play, anyways, over on the New Jersey side. We have a return from concussion protocol, and it's not return to play initially. It's return to school. It's return to practice. It's return to health before it's anywhere close to return to play. And those are varying degrees of time. It's a week sometimes. It's 2 weeks, and sometimes it's longer. I've had kids that have missed 3 months at youth hockey because of concussions. And I've also had my own children who've missed due to concussions. And that's where I would like to bring in the baseline test, and maybe it's debatable later. I don't know. But every neurologist that I talk to say it's important, it's vital that we get our children baseline testing. Not that it's perfect, but it allows them to have something to fall back on when you bring your child in to be evaluated. My 15-year-old suffered his first documented concussion 3 years ago, and we followed proper procedure. We had him sitting out. He was home from school. He wasn't allowed to read, watch TV, play video games, any of the above. And 5 days into it, he's bouncing off the walls. And my wife and I are looking at each other like, this is crazy. We got to get him not only back to school, he's got to get back on the ice, or he's going to drive us nuts. And I took him back for his baseline, and he failed miserably. And for me, after going through my own personal history, to see that, it was a real eye-opener, because at that point I understood it was more than just he looks better, he feels better. The brain moves at its own rate, and we have to make sure that we follow its rate and its pace.
Thanks. Brian, final comment?
I think it's important that, especially for football, because it's what I know and understand the best, the trainers and the doctors, they work for the team. And so a lot of time, unless you have that brave trainer that Keith had, a lot of time they're willing to sacrifice just a little bit on the player side for the team and put a guy back out there that probably should not be playing. And I think that's why it's so important to have an independent doctor that these guys go see. I didn't experience this in Philadelphia. My trainer was great. He said, listen, Andy Reid, I don't care what you say. And Andy didn't push me to get back out there, but he said, we're going to do what's right by Brian. And not every trainer across the professional level, college level, is willing to do that. And you're talking about kids, younger and younger kids, 10, 12 years old, experiencing concussions. And I know when I was 12 for Boys and Girls Club, my dad was a coach, he was a trainer, he was a team mom, he was snacks, he was involved with everything. And so, I mean, he wasn't prepared to diagnose a concussion. So at that point, if you don't have those types of doctors for these young kids, then how are they going to know? How are they going to be educated enough to make that decision that, you know what, this is a mild concussion and I shouldn't play for another week, or this is a serious case and I shouldn't play ever again. I think the NFL is trying to make strides in that department. They're eliminating concussions, but you also have to think about, there's been guys that come out and say, you know, we can't hit guys anymore, you can't do this anymore, and these are players that these kids look up to. Their game is smash mouth football, hitting people in the mouth, knocking people out. That's what they do good and do well, and so that's what they want to be able to do. And the hard part is being able to say to a guy that isn't quite the fastest, isn't quite the strongest, but he can knock someone out, you can't do that anymore. You have to change your game. Unfortunately for those guys, they're out of the league. They can't play anymore. So they want that type of physicalness still left in the game. And at some point, I think the NFL has to understand, and all major sports have to understand the health of the players, their product, which is the players, is much more important than one more play, one more down, one more goal for any sport.
Well, we could stay up here all day talking about this. Maybe some of you want that, but we have to move on. Let's thank this panel. It's been great. And we'll bring up the next panel.